Yeah, that was a baobab tree actually, near the Tema Harbor. You know, when they were constructing the harbor, there was this tree that was in the way, and they did everything they couldn't uproot it. And there was this tree which would not move. So the foreman suggested to the contractors that they should contact the priest in the area. And so they contacted him, and he asked for one sheep and some bottles of schnapps. And he came to the tree, and he slaughtered the sheep and poured libation and told them that the spirit in the tree has decided to move. So they could then go ahead and uproot the tree. It was as big as this. And so they started ordering the bulldozers to get near the tree, but the priest told them not to worry. They should just tie a rope around the tree and pull it. And they tied a rope around it, pulled it, and it came down root and branch. They couldn't believe it.
You mean they had modern equipment?
Yes, and they couldn't move the tree.
Bulldozers?
Bulldozers, nothing could move it. Yeah. That's why they took the advice of the foreman. So well, let's try it. You know, they were ready to try anything.
You're saying something extremely profound. You're saying that the African priest came.
Yeah.
Poured libation.
Slaughtered the sheep.
Talked
to the spirit in the tree.
To the spirit in the tree.
And it agreed to move so they could do what they were out there to do. And the people started ordering the bulldozers. He said, don't worry, tie a rope around it. They tied a rope around it and pulled it. That's all they needed. With their hands. And it came down root and branch. You see, we have access to some knowledge in Africa that you would describe as hidden. Only a few people have access to this knowledge. But it's only because, you see, this knowledge dates from millions. I mean, we've lived in these forests for millions of years, and so we must know our way about. We must understand the environment in which we live. And people, herbalists, can go and talk to trees, talk to leaves, and so on. Exchange, communicate with them before they bring them home. We can't communicate with nature. So, in recent years, when I read in America, you know, people would talk to plants and so on, and the plants would respond. You know, I said, well, you think this is new? We've known this for millions of years.
You're saying something that's too fantastic to believe. How is one to understand that in Africa there are powers, understanding where you could communicate with trees and with nature, and it actually responds to you, like the spirit leaving the tree.
Yeah.
And yet the European was able to conquer Africa. I don't quite, why didn't we use those powers on him?
Well, the point is that, you see, the power, as the years wore on, came to be in the hands of a few people. But the point is that the power is still here. You see, of all the people in the world, Africans are the only ones who could not be exterminated by the Europeans.
How do you mean that?
Yeah, they were able, but we have not been exterminated. And the European domination is only so much. Every European who is in his right senses will recognize, although he may not admit it, his own limitations when he comes to Africa, because he realizes that there's a large area over which he has no control, of which he has very little or no knowledge. So all he does is to consign it to the realm of superstition. But it's not superstition. If you know it, you know that it's knowledge. You see, our ancestors devised various tools for addressing the various problems that we have. All reality is not limited to our sense experience. What the European has dominated is the material, sense experiential aspect of human life, or of all of reality. But reality goes beyond our sense experiences. Our sense experiences constitute only one aspect of reality, not all of reality. That's why they say if the only tool you have is a hammer, you treat everything like a nail. But for some things you need an axe, or a hoe, or a cutlass. and a hammer is not useful. You see? So there's still a large realm of African life that has not been conquered by Europeans.
Welcome everyone to episode 9 of Unspoken Podcast. I am Anna Paz, and today we're going to be continuing on with part 5 of my 6-part series of my master's thesis, Coming to Voice through Capoeira, Uncovering the Ancestrality and Embodiments of the African Diaspora. Now, if this is your first time listening, I recommend that you go check out some of the earlier episodes that have Coming to Voice in the title, where I share a short performative introduction and overview of the research. In this episode, I'm going to be reviewing one other framework that I used, as well as bell hooks, choosing the margin as a space for radical openness. I used this framework to understand the more recent history that Capoeira sits on and how it might affect the practice in ways it has evolved and how it has developed. I will also be quoting from the book Capoeira, The History of an Afro-Brazilian Martial Art by Matheus Assunção. So this other framework is Sara Ahmed's Phenomenology of Whiteness, and I use this particular framework as a way to explore, as Ahmed explains, the ongoing and unfinished history which orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space and what they can do. Weaving in bell hooks from margin to center, where Hooks explains to be in the margin is to be part of the whole, but also outside of the main body. Here we're considering orientations, the orientation from margin to center, and what occurs physically with the bodies in the practice of capoeira and in the development of the practice itself. It's a reflection also of the ongoing unfinished histories that continue to pervade our wider societal structures, orientating us in particular directions. Ahmed refers to and analyzes Fanon's 1967 book, Black Skin, White Masks, a specific moment that addresses how whiteness is involved in orientating Fanon's experience of wanting to light a cigarette. Ahmed explains, what is reachable is determined precisely by orientations we have already taken. This puts the trajectory of Capoeira Regional into perspective. What is highlighted through Mestre Bimba, one of the great teachers and pioneers of Capoeira, who was very concerned with the survival and preservation of the art, whether conscious or not, and whether it was desired or not, he inherited this center of orientation. When we think about the 40 years after the abolition of slavery, in which capoeira was heavily criminalized, the orientation of black bodies from the inception of their arrival in the Americas, what black bodies could do were extremely limited, controlled. This is a particular embodiment that is inherited. So then whiteness operates as a central point of orientation, not only for African people, of course, but also the indigenous Americans. One could argue then, for the sake of survival, that capoeira would naturally or systemically move towards a space where she would have to negotiate or create dialogue with a central point of orientation, where she would have to move from the margin and perhaps work towards some type of proximity to whiteness. As Ahmed says, doing things depends not so much on intrinsic capacity or even dispositions or habits, but on the ways in which the world is available as a space for action, a space where things have a certain place or are in place. So I'm thinking about Capoeira Regional because in some ways it was the style that first came to the masses as popular culture. It came to the masses when it was able to create a school with a martial arts approach. White uniforms, good posture, a grading system could be, easily taught, replicated, and then somewhat become profitable to those who could take advantage of that opportunity when the middle class began to be involved. So this particular orientation manifested through very specific conditions, many layered events and influences that it wasn't just one single action of the present moment, but actually several actions that were created over time. Going towards the end of the 19th century, elite Brazilians were in search of an identity that summed up who they were. Nevertheless, the idea of whitening, especially in relation to the majority of their ancestors that would be either African or indigenous, this would not be in line with the European imperialistic design that they wanted to subscribe to. It wouldn't be aligned to their central point of orientation. Prominent theory amongst the intellectuals was that the inferior racial characteristics would perhaps over time become whiter, which was when there was a surge of invited European immigrants, which is something that is very well documented. The mestiço, the one with mixed blood, could therefore be considered as a positive step towards whiteness. Not because it creates a neutral middle ground for all races involved, but because it would be considered as the process, the step forward towards where whiteness is the end goal. There are some that were thinking about an idea of perfection as well, some sort of new identity, a new racial type. As Assunção writes in his book, the mestiço would become a new racial type and by the same token lose the negative characteristics most racial theorists associated with the unstable mixed blood, in quotation. So in this particular period, there began the agenda to integrate or perhaps consider capoeira as a national sport that could speak to the identity of Brazil. This did not come with the negation of its African cultural and religious traditions being minimized, violently controlled, heavily politicized and militarized. During the early 1900s, capoeira would slowly become, to nationalists and middle-class Brazilians, an object of identity as they began to consider capoeira our game. In consideration to becoming a national sport, the idea of capoeira had to serve national ideals. It had to be hygienized, adapted, and reformed. In other words, distance itself from its African context or the history that would ridicule some of the Eurocentric or fascist views that they were trying to adopt. And to quote Assunção, cultural nationalism became hegemonic during the period of 1930 to 1964 and has remained influential at state level ever since. So with that being said, when Ahmed explains a phenomenology of whiteness, it is to help us to notice the institutional habits, how it brings about what is behind to the surface, what does not get seen as the background social action with this particular orientation of capoeira at the time. What were the institutional habits happening behind that came to the surface in some way, either now or maybe even 30 years ago? So one could argue that with this detachment to its Africanness, there was a detachment to its several other dimensions of understanding its knowledge and its technologies, capoeira. There was a detachment to traditions. And yeah, like I said, this technology that came from thousands of years of cultivated systems of knowing. This is when capoeira was able to become a national symbol for Brazilian culture. And of course, this can be considered a strategy of survival, of engaging with the center whilst remaining in a space of resistance. But as Assunção mentions in his book, given the Americanization of culture at the global scale, capoeira has become, for many Brazilians, alongside samba and football, this important tool for the struggle to resist cultural imperialism. But I would argue that this is a struggle, and that even if Brazilians try to reject this, that imperialism is creating the framework or has created the framework for Brazilianness, which, with every generation would create greater chances of an individual not becoming aware of where some of their cultural influences have come from and valuing that, whether indigenous, African, or European, rendering it just Brazilian. So as generations of Capoeira go, what we consider is culture is further embedded, forgetting the past and how it is intrinsically woven into the present becomes embodied through inheritance. This is reinforced by the hegemonic structures within the practice, simply because of the first central point of orientation. But I would pose the question, who gains and who loses in the end from this social historical amnesia when structural racism continues to persist and disproportionately impact Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples? Who does that serve? Undoubtedly, these issues will continue to arise as a response of the deep histories that are intertwined and still produce these spaces of inequality. I see, of course, the possibility of Capoeira being a space of radical openness that through balancing history and everything that lays under the surface with consciousness and standing firmly as leaders to be vessels for that opening, to bring about that transformative way of seeing, in particular for those who have been really severed from their understanding of self. It's important, and I say this through my experience, because I didn't know that Capoeira could connect me to my ancestrality. I didn't know that Capoeira could give me some insight to my lived experience of how colonialism has impacted my family in the last 50 years. I didn't know that when I was practicing this, I was understanding my center and I was removing a particular orientation, central orientation, and I'm sure I will never be able to remove it entirely. Understanding my roots was not really something that was particularly taught at the time at home. It was more important to assimilate, and it seemed that the proximity to, of course, whiteness as a center was the world around me, was the world that I was dwelling in, even if the majority of the world that I was around was black. So if I had any understanding of something like Capoeira, it was, of course, whitewashed, and it had nothing in common with me to propel me into a space that would empower me or to speak to a massive part of my understanding of my identity. It wasn't something that would make me understand it as a space rooted in resistance, a space that I already dwelled in, a space that would open a door to another space, one where an understanding of this ancestral knowledge would allow me to sit more comfortably, at least in myself, if not the world. I was already in it, but I wasn't aware because this space was not being made visible to me, simply because of the first central point of orientation. If whiteness is the thing that is the central point of orientation, determining which way the practice can move, which way you can move, and understanding history, I become more aware of why I may have felt all of these levels of difficulties when I started my journey, in particular in regional spaces, but also in Angola spaces, of being uncomfortable with particular behaviors relating to these positions of power, the spaces that are predominantly white. I realized that it ultimately has nothing actually to do with style, but it has everything to do with what runs and lies under the surface, behind, in the background, that eventually does come to the surface, especially with a practice like Capoeira. What runs and lies under the surface of not only the practice, but also the individual, reinforced by the hegemonic societal structures orientating us in particular directions. That is the conversation that we are first having before having a conversation with the body that's in front of us, before having a conversation with the instruments, before having a conversation even with the oral tradition that is being shared. We are first having a conversation with the central point of orientation. This central point of orientation is determining which way you can move, what you can do, and what you can say. What is your place? As Ahmed states, the desire for resistance is not the same as the desire for good practice. So even with the style of Angola, said to be closer to its African roots, and in some ways it is, I think in many ways it has followed the same framework that Regional did, especially when traveling to Europe and coming back to Brazil. This is because they have the same inheritance, they have the same orientation, a system that is held up by that central point of orientation of which patriarchal norms continue to manifest, where capitalism is in operation above resistance, where it unfortunately unconsciously keeps some people in the space and keeps some others out. Whether we're conscious or not, whether we desire it or not. Why is that happening? Why is this space not seeming accessible, even if it is? And why is something like the visibility of Black women important in a space? When we think about a work that is transmitting ancestral knowledge that at its deepest core derives from African roots, why is it important for Black women to be in the space? I'm going to be talking about that in part 6, which will be my final part of my overview of this master's thesis. And I don't know if you remember, but I decided to go anti-clockwise, to start where I ended and to end where I started. And hopefully this will give a little bit more indication as to where I'm going with my research, God willing, my journey of researching this with the particular focus on Black women and what I feel could be my contribution in developing a space of radical openness that includes Capoeira as a tool. So, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one.